The morning I buried my wife of 43 years, my son asked me for the password to her laptop. Not a hug, not a word about her, just the password. I stood there in the funeral home parking lot in Kingston, Ontario, still wearing the same black suit I'd worn to our daughter's wedding 11 years earlier, and I watched my only son hold out his hand like I owed him something. 3 weeks later, he would sit across from me at my own kitchen table and tell me he'd already listed my house with a realtor. He would smile when he said it, the way his mother used to smile at strangers in the grocery store, and I would smile back. Because what my son didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd already packed my life into the back of my old Ford pickup and driven 800 kilometers north. My wife had left me something. Something she'd been building quietly, patiently, for the last 6 years of her life. And my son was about to learn that his mother, the woman he thought he understood, had seen this coming from a long way off. My name is Daniel Thornberry, and I am 67 years old. I spent 41 years working as a millwright at the paper mill in Kingston before I retired in 2019. My wife Margaret worked as a school librarian until her knees gave out, and even after that, she kept reading to kids at the public library twice a week, right up until the pancreatic cancer took her in early autumn. We raised 2 children, my son Connor, who is 41 and works as some kind of consultant in Toronto, and my daughter Rosalind, who passed away in a car accident on the 401 outside Napanee in 2014. After we lost Rosalind, something in Margaret changed. She grew quieter, more watchful. She started taking long drives by herself on weekends and wouldn't tell me where she'd gone. I thought it was grief. I thought she needed space. I loved her enough to give it to her. What I didn't know was that she was planning. The night before Margaret's funeral, my daughter-in-law Priya came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes, and she put her hand on my shoulder and told me she was worried about me. She said that a house this size was too much for one man. She said that Connor had been talking about my future, about how I should start thinking practically, about how the market in Kingston was strong right now, and it might be a good time to consider my options. I stared at the water running over my hands, and I thought about how Margaret had been dead for less than 72 hours. I didn't say anything. I just nodded the way a man nods when he doesn't trust himself to speak. Priya squeezed my shoulder and told me that Connor only wanted what was best for me. Then she went back to the living room, and I heard her laughing softly at something on her phone. The funeral itself was held at St. Mark's Anglican Church on a gray Tuesday in late September. Margaret had picked out the hymns herself, which was something I only learned from the minister afterwards. She had apparently met with him 3 times over the summer to plan the whole service. She'd chosen the readings. She'd written instructions about the flowers. She had even paid for the reception in advance so that nobody would have to argue about the catering. I stood in the front pew and listened to my son deliver a eulogy that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd met Margaret twice. He talked about her dedication to family, which was true, and her generosity, which was true, and then he made a joke about her cooking that got a polite laugh from the congregation. He didn't mention Rosalind. Not once. Margaret had talked about Rosalind every single day for 10 years, and my son couldn't find room for her name in his mother's eulogy. After the service, at the reception in the church hall, Connor pulled me aside near the coffee urns. He said he understood this wasn't the right time, but that we needed to think about practical matters sooner rather than later. He said his mother's estate was going to be complicated. He said he'd already spoken with a lawyer friend in Toronto who specialized in elder care transitions. He used that phrase, elder care transitions, like he was reading it off a brochure. I asked him what he meant. He said he meant that I was alone now, that I was getting older, that the house was paid off but the property taxes weren't getting any smaller, and that there was a very nice retirement community in Oshawa that had a waiting list but that his friend could help me get bumped up. I looked at my son, at the face I'd held in my hands the night he was born, and I didn't recognize him. I told him we'd talk about it later. He said we'd talk about it soon. He squeezed my arm the way you squeeze a deal closed. 3 days after the funeral, I drove out to our family lawyer's office on Princess Street. His name is Harold Beauchamp, and he'd known Margaret since they were both in high school together in the 1970s. When I walked into his office, he stood up and hugged me, which is not something Harold has ever done in the 40 years I've known him. Then he sat me down and he slid a sealed envelope across the desk. He told me Margaret had left instructions. She had written this letter 18 months ago. when she first got her diagnosis, and she had updated it twice since then. The last update had been in August. Harold told me he had been under strict instructions not to contact me until at least 3 days after the burial. Margaret had wanted me to have time to feel the loss before I had to deal with anything else. I opened the envelope in Harold's office. I didn't want to read it alone in the house. The letter was 4 pages long, written in Margaret's careful cursive, and it began by telling me she was sorry. She was sorry she had kept secrets from me. She was sorry she had let me worry about her weekend drives. She was sorry she had not found a way to bring me into her plan while she was still alive. But she had her reasons, she wrote, and she hoped I would understand when I saw what she had built. And then she told me about the property. 6 years ago, shortly after the 2nd anniversary of Rosalind's death, Margaret had used an inheritance from her aunt in Nova Scotia, combined with a quiet loan against her own share of our home equity line of credit, to purchase 160 acres of land on the shore of Lake Timiskaming, up near Haileybury. She had bought it from an elderly couple who were downsizing. The property had a log cabin on it, a boathouse, a small dock, and 200 meters of shoreline. Over the next 6 years, using money she saved from her teacher's pension and from investments she had made through her own TFSA and a non-registered account Harold had set up for her, Margaret had renovated the cabin, winterized it, and paid off the mortgage. The property was now debt-free, held in a trust with my name as the sole beneficiary, and it was valued, according to the most recent assessment, at roughly 640,000 Canadian dollars. In addition to the property, Margaret had left me an investment account at BMO with a balance of $312,000. Neither of these assets were part of our joint estate. Neither of them would pass through probate. Neither of them were any of Connor's business. I sat in Harold's office for a long time after I finished reading. Harold didn't say anything. He just poured me a glass of water and waited. Finally, I asked him why. Why had Margaret hidden this from me? Harold took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly on his tie. He said Margaret had told him many times that she loved our son, but she did not trust him. She had watched Connor change, slowly, after he married Priya. She had watched him become someone who measured everything in terms of value and return. She had known, Harold said, that the day she died, Connor would start circling, and she had wanted me to have somewhere safe to go, somewhere he couldn't find me, somewhere he couldn't sell. I drove home that afternoon and I sat in my kitchen and I looked around at the house Margaret and I had lived in for 39 years. The wallpaper in the hallway that she had picked out in 1994. The kitchen table where Rosalind had done her homework. The back door where we had hung Connor's first pair of hockey skates. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight my son. I wasn't going to stand in this kitchen and argue about property taxes and waiting lists. Margaret had given me a door. I was going to walk through it. That evening, I called Harold back, and I asked him to help me with 3 things. First, I wanted to know how quickly I could legally list the Kingston house for sale on my own terms, at my own pace, with no input from Connor. Harold said that since the house had been held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship, it was now entirely mine, and I could do whatever I wanted with it. Second, I wanted to know what it would take to set up a new will that left the lake property and the investment account to a charitable trust in Rosalind's name, with only a small token bequest to Connor. Harold said he could have the paperwork ready in 48 hours. Third, I asked him if he knew anyone in Haileybury who could help me get the cabin ready for a long-term resident. Harold laughed for the first time since Margaret's death. He said Margaret had already arranged that too. There was a caretaker, a retired fisherman named Gilles Tremblay, who had been looking after the property for the last 3 years. He was expecting me. I spent the next 2 weeks doing 2 things in parallel. During the day, I was the grieving widower. I let my son call me and ask me how I was doing. I let him bring Priya over for dinner and pretend to care about my week. I let him talk about Oshawa and elder care transitions, and how maybe we should start sorting through Mom's things soon because it wasn't healthy to let them sit. I nodded. I made the appropriate noises. At one point, Priya actually opened Margaret's closet and started pulling out sweaters and asking if she could take them for a clothing donation. I told her I wasn't ready. She said that was understandable, but maybe next week. I smiled. I said, maybe next week. At night, After they left, I packed. I packed slowly and carefully. I took the things that mattered. The photo albums from before Rosalind died. Margaret's wedding ring, which she had asked to be removed before the cremation. The pocket watch my father had given me when I finished my apprenticeship in 1979. My tools, my fishing gear, Margaret's library of Canadian poetry, a framed drawing Rosalind had made in grade 2 of our family standing in front of a house with a yellow sun. I boxed these things up and I loaded them into a rental trailer I'd hooked up to my truck in the driveway behind the house, where nobody would see it from the street. I left the furniture, I left the dishes, I left the wallpaper in the hallway. I figured Connor could have all of it. He was going to anyway. The morning I drove north, it was raining. I left the key under the mat for the cleaning service Harold had arranged. I left a note on the kitchen table that said, only, "I've gone away for a while. Please do not worry about me. I will be in touch when I am ready." I signed it with my first name. No endearment, no love, just Daniel. Then I got in my truck and I drove up Highway 401 to Highway 416 to the 417 through Ottawa, and then north on Highway 17 along the Ottawa River, and I kept driving until the land flattened out and the trees got smaller and the radio stations got quieter. I crossed into the Temiskaming region just after dark, and I stopped for the night at a motel outside New Liskeard. The next morning I drove the final 20 minutes to the cabin, and when I pulled up the gravel driveway and saw the lake for the first time, I started crying and I couldn't stop for almost an hour. Gilles Tremblay was waiting on the front porch with a thermos of coffee and a plate of tourtière his wife had made. He was about my age, broad-shouldered, with a white mustache and eyes that didn't ask questions. He helped me unload the trailer. He showed me how the wood stove worked, where the generator was, how to turn the water on from the pump house. He gave me a list of phone numbers, the propane guy, the plow guy, the guy who fixed the dock. Then he shook my hand and told me that Margaret had been a good woman. He said she used to drive up here alone in the summers and sit on the dock and write in a notebook for hours. He said she had told him, more than once, that this place was for her husband, that she was building it for him, that when the time came he would know what to do with it. I lived there for 11 days before my son figured out I was gone. It was Priya who noticed first. She had apparently let herself into the house using a key Margaret had given her years ago, something I only learned later. She had gone in to start clearing out Margaret's things without asking me, and she had found the house empty. Not just me gone, but my clothes gone, my tools gone, Margaret's jewelry gone. She called Connor. Connor called me. I let the call go to voicemail. He called again. He called a third time. He left a message that started calm and ended with him shouting. He wanted to know where I was. He wanted to know what I had done with Mom's things. He wanted to know if I had lost my mind. I called him back the next morning from the dock, with the lake glittering behind me and a loon calling somewhere out past the point. I told him I was fine. I told him I had gone somewhere quiet to think. I told him that I would not be returning to Kingston in the foreseeable future, and that he should make peace with that. He asked me where I was. I told him that was not his concern. He asked me what had gotten into me. I told him his mother had died and I was grieving in my own way. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked about the house. He actually used that word first. Not the house, just house. As in, what about the house? I told him the house was mine, and I would deal with it in my own time. He said that he and Priya had been talking, and that they thought it might be best if power of attorney were transferred, given my state of mind. I told him that his mother had been the only person who ever had power of attorney over my affairs, and that she had left clear instructions, and I told him not to call me again until he was ready to speak to his father like a son instead of like a liquidator. Then I hung up. He did not stop calling. He called my lawyer. He called the Kingston police, claiming I was a missing person, which was embarrassing for everyone involved once they ran the file and realized I'd left a note. He called my brother in Sudbury and demanded to know what I had told him. He hired a private investigator who took 3 weeks and $1,800 to discover that I had used my own credit card to pay for fuel in Mattawa. And then, on a cold afternoon in late October, my son drove up that gravel driveway in a rented SUV with Priya in the passenger seat, and he stood on my front porch and demanded to be let in. I opened the door, but I did not step aside. I told him he was welcome to say what he needed to say from the porch. Priya, behind him, was already looking past me into the cabin, her eyes doing the math, cataloging. Connor started talking. He said he was hurt. He said I had abandoned him during the worst period of his life. He said I had taken things from the Kingston house that belonged to the estate, that belonged to the family, and that he had a right to know what I had done with them. I asked him which things specifically, he faltered. He mentioned the jewelry. I told him Margaret's jewelry had been left specifically to me. He mentioned the photo albums. I told him the photo albums were mine. He mentioned, finally, the investment account at BMO, which he apparently had learned about from a statement that had been forwarded to the Kingston address. I said nothing. I just looked at him. Priya stepped forward and asked, very gently, if she could come inside and use the washroom. I told her there was a gas station about 12 kilometers back toward town. She looked at me like I had slapped her. Connor then tried a different approach. He softened his voice. He said he understood why I was angry. He said he and Priya had been worried about me for months, and that maybe they had come on too strong. He said he wanted us to start over. He asked if he could come inside and just sit with me for a while, man to man, father and son. He said Mom would have wanted that. And that was the line that did it. That was the moment I stopped feeling sad and started feeling something quieter and harder. I told my son that his mother had wanted many things. She had wanted him to come home for Rosalind's memorial service, which he had skipped 2 years in a row because of work. She had wanted him to call her more than once a month. She had wanted him to remember her birthday, without Priya reminding him. She had wanted, most of all, for him to grow into a man she could be proud of, and she had died without knowing whether that would ever happen. I told him that I was not going to be his next project. I told him that the door was closing now, and that if he wanted to see me again, he could write me a letter. A real letter, handwritten, and if I believed what was in it, I might write back. Then I closed the door. They drove away. I watched them from the kitchen window. Priya was crying, I think, or maybe she was just yelling. Connor was on the phone before they even reached the end of the driveway. The weeks after that were the hardest of my life, but also, in a strange way, the most clear. I worked on the cabin. I cut firewood. Gilles taught me how to set a proper ice fishing tilt and how to drive the little ATV through the bush trails without high centering on a stump. I drove into town once a week for groceries and to pick up mail at the post office box Harold had set up for me. I started writing, for the first time in my life, in a notebook Margaret had left in the cabin. It was the same notebook Gilles had mentioned. Half of it was already full of her handwriting. Letters to me, it turned out. Letters she had written over the years while sitting on the dock, planning. The last letter was dated 2 weeks before she died. It said, "Daniel, if you're reading this, it means you found it. It means you did what I hoped you would do. Stay, fish, read, forgive yourself for whatever you think you did wrong. And if Connor comes, remember, a door closed is not the same as a door locked. Leave him a key. Just make sure it's on your terms." 5 months passed. Winter came hard and then softened into a long, wet spring. The ice broke up on the lake in late April with a sound like distant thunder. I had not heard from Connor in all that time. I had heard, through Harold, that he had tried to contest the estate, that he had tried to claim the Kingston house had been partially his mother's separate property, that he had been told by 3 separate lawyers to stop wasting his money. I had heard that he and Priya had separated briefly and then reconciled. I had heard that Priya had started her own real estate company using what she called, in a LinkedIn post Harold showed me, a significant personal investment from family. And then, in early May, a letter arrived at my post office box, handwritten, 3 pages, from my son. It was not a good letter. It was not the letter I had hoped for. But it was honest, in places, in ways that surprised me. He wrote that he did not fully understand what had happened between us. He wrote that he had been angry at me for disappearing, and angry at his mother for dying, and angry, in a way he could not explain, at the fact that he had not been more present at the end. He wrote that he had always assumed his parents would be there when he was ready, and that he had discovered, too late, that readiness is not something life waits for. He wrote that he did not expect me to forgive him, but he asked if he could come and see me. Once, without Priya, without an agenda, just to sit on the dock with his father for an afternoon. I thought about that letter for 9 days before I wrote back. What I finally wrote was this: "Come in June, come alone, bring nothing. Stay for one night. We will not talk about money or property or what your mother did or did not leave, to whom. We will fish. We will eat. We will sit by the fire. If, at the end of the visit, I believe you are capable of being my son again, I will tell you so. If I do not believe it, I will drive you back to the bus station in North Bay, and we will part politely, and you will not contact me again. Either way, you will not inherit this cabin. That has been decided. This land goes to a trust in your sister's name, and it will be used to fund scholarships for young women in the Kingston area, studying early childhood education, which was what Rosalind had been planning to do before she died. I told him this not to hurt him, but because I wanted him to arrive knowing exactly what was on the table and exactly what was not. He came in the second week of June. He drove up in a 10-year-old Honda Civic, which surprised me, and he stepped out of it looking thinner than I remembered, and older than his 41 years. He did not try to hug me. He just nodded, the way his grandfather used to nod, and he asked where he should put his bag. I showed him the spare room. Gilles had left a fresh-caught walleye in the fridge that morning, and I cooked it for supper with new potatoes and a bottle of beer I'd been saving since March. After dinner, we walked down to the dock. The sun was setting late, the way it does in June that far north. Loons were calling. Connor sat on the edge of the dock with his feet in the cold water, and he cried for a long time without speaking. I sat beside him. I did not touch him. I did not speak. I just waited. He stayed for 3 days instead of 1. On the second day, he asked quietly if there had ever been a point where I thought he was a good son. I told him yes. I told him when he was 9 years old, he had saved up his paper route money for 4 months to buy his mother a set of good kitchen knives for Christmas, because she had mentioned in passing one night at dinner that her old ones were getting dull. I told him I had cried when I saw him wrap them in the garage, using too much tape, sticking the bow on crooked. I told him that boy was still inside him somewhere, and that his mother had believed, right up until the end, that the boy could still come back. Connor did not speak for a long time after I said that. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." On the third day, I drove him to North Bay, and I put him on a bus, and I told him he could write to me again if he wanted. I did not promise anything beyond that. He understood. I am 70 now, 3 years past that first summer, and I still live in the cabin on Lake Timiskaming. Gilles still comes by twice a week. The scholarship fund in Rosalind's name has sent 4 young women to college so far, and this past Christmas I received a letter from one of them, a girl from Gananoque named Abigail, thanking me for a chance she did not know how to repay. I wrote back and told her the only repayment I wanted was for her to someday do the same for somebody else. Connor writes to me every month, short letters mostly. He is separated from Priya permanently now, and he is living in a smaller place in Toronto, and he has started visiting a therapist, and he has told me, without asking for anything in return, that he is sorry. I believe him, mostly. He comes up for a week every summer. He does not bring up the Kingston house, which sold 2 years ago for nearly $700,000, money that went entirely into the scholarship trust. He knows that the door is open, and the door is also clear. Margaret used to say that a marriage is a long conversation you have with one person across many decades, and that the trick is to keep listening even when you think you already know what the other person is going to say. I did not always listen well. I missed things. I assumed things. But in the end, in the years after she died, I finally understood the last thing she was trying to tell me. That love, real love, is not only about what you give to the people you love while you are with them. It is also about what you build for them, quietly, so that when you are gone, they will have somewhere to stand. Margaret built me a place to stand. I am standing on it now. And every morning when I walk down to the dock with my coffee and watch the mist come off the lake, I thank her. I thank her for knowing me better than I knew myself. I thank her for seeing what was coming before I could see it. I thank her for loving me enough to plan past her own death. And I thank her most of all for leaving the door unlocked for the boy who once bought his mother a set of kitchen knives. Because that boy, it turned out, was still in there. He just needed his father to stop being afraid and to wait.